And Brian, thank you so much for sharing that reading with us this morning. That was great. And apropos to what Brian was saying, there's a Ron and Margaret Hopkinson here this morning somewhere. Where are you? There you are. Yes. So stand up, you two. We don't normally embarrass visitors in our congregation like this. But Ron and Margaret are visiting from Regina, I gather. And Ron, the two of you lived here back in the 70s, and you chaired our worship committee at that time.
Sang in the choir.
And you sang in the choir. It's lovely having you back. And hopefully there's enough similarity between what happens in worship now and what happened back then, so you feel totally at home here.
The sanctuary is the same.
The sanctuary is the same. We have a diplomat in our midst. Thank you so much. It's lovely having you both with us this morning. A very warm welcome. I'm talking about changes this morning, how life is always changing. Isaac Asimov, the well-known science fiction writer, once quipped. He said, "Life is generally pleasant. Death is generally peaceful. It's just the transitions that are troublesome." Well, I'm not so sure life is always pleasant, and I'm not so sure death is always peaceful, but I am absolutely positive that transitions are generally, in our sort of sense of things, troublesome. Danielle tells me, she says, Danielle always tells me, I have to give you at least 6 months notice before we plan anything radically different in our life or make any major change because it takes you so long to adjust to anything. And I kind of take issue with that characterization of me by my spouse, but I suspect there is a little bit of truth to what she says. And it's because we do find transitions in our lives generally troublesome, and I feel that way too, that I so feel for the folks from Fort McMurray, right? How many of you have just, for those folks from Fort McMurray, just to have that kind of sudden destruction just visited upon them, losing so many of their homes, so many of their businesses, and not just to fire, but you hear the stories about many of them are going back now in their homes, the homes that haven't been burned down, haven't had electricity, and for many of them, their freezers are moldy and their fridges are wrecked and their houses are just in terrible shape. So that kind of unexpected change that has happened in their lives must be monumentally hard and troublesome to deal with. And I know for people too in the last months who have had sudden health kinds of issues that have visited upon them as well, that have just come right out of the blue. We've had a number of those in the congregation. It's one thing when you get a sort of a diagnosis or you feel something's coming on, but it's a totally different thing when all of a sudden it's like, and I'm looking at one of them right now, and we know what it's like, right? When out of the blue, something comes at you, as in terms of a health crisis. It's really, really hard to wrap your head around that. And it actually shakes your whole kind of foundation and sense of trust in life when those kinds of things happen. But the truth of the reality is, whether you're living in Fort McMurray or one of the people who have gone through a health crisis here, life is, somebody once said, if you don't like change, get used to it, because life is, from the day we're born, it's one continuous process of change and transitioning between one state to another state to another state to another state. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So it's built into the human condition. It's a functional part of what it means to be human. If you look at the passage that Brian read for us this morning from the life of Jesus, right? I mean, Jesus' life was just characterized by a constant process of change as well. But we really see that become pronounced with the beginning of his ministry, right? So from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, first he goes to the Jordan to be baptized by John, and that sort of kicks it off. And then the first thing he does once he's baptized by John, he heads off into the wilderness for who it says 40 days, but that's kind of a classic number in the scriptures. It's for a long time. He heads off into the wilderness for a long time to just kind of get himself ready and get himself prepared. And that's a hard transition in itself. Being around people, living with people all the time, now going and living by yourself in a cave in the wilderness for a long time. And then after he does that, he comes back and he moves to a new community from where he used to live, and he has to adjust to that. And then he starts calling a whole bunch of new disciples to be his followers. He's setting up a team, right? And the disciples are absolutely useless. This is the truth of the matter. We learn this from Jesus. His disciples are totally ill-equipped. They are unprepared for this kind of mission that they are about to embark on with Jesus. But to give the disciples credit, you hear quite quickly that they too have to face this radical change. Jesus has this change in his life. He's all of a sudden working with a group of people that he didn't know before and that he has to prepare for this kind of ministry. They, on their part, they leave their jobs and their families and their homes behind to follow this guy. They don't know, who knows where they're going to be going. And so that's a whole radical process of change. And then, do they live in one nice, comfy, cozy place for the next 3 years? Jesus says, foxes have dens and birds have nests to lay their heads, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head, right? So it's a wandering, itinerant kind of role. He's constantly with his disciples, moving from one place to another place to another place. They're on the road constantly. I was at a little concert last night with a house concert here in Bedford, the Patchwork Concerts. I don't know if any of you know Patchwork, but it's a great family, Monique and George, who run these house concerts. And the musician Roxanne Potvin, who was there last night, she was saying one of the hardest things about being a musician is that you're on the road all the time. You're traveling all the time in order to make a living. And she says you meet all these wonderful people, but you meet them once. And she says it's so hard meeting all these lovely people, and then you see them once, you chat with them, and then you're gone. You know, hasta vida, so long, and you don't see them again. So that's the kind of ministry that Jesus had as well. He was constantly on the road. And of course, then he runs into conflict with the authorities, and then of course he runs into the whole crucifixion. And that's the hugest transition of all that any of us face. He has to face his own death head on. So Jesus' entire life was a life that was punctuated and characterized by one change after another change after another change, one transition after another transition after another transition. So I've been thinking a lot about transitions lately because we're going through some significant transitions within our own community and with our own congregation. That guy is transitioning right up here, right? So Rick is moving through a time of radical transition in his own life, which also means there's going to be a time of radical transition in our collective life, because he's moving from being our full-time minister for children, well, originally for children, and he's gone through a number of transitions, but being our youth minister and a minister of music, so he's leaving that whole youth ministry piece behind, going into full-time studies, and he's going to be working at a significantly reduced capacity doing just music here at BUC. And that's a big transition for Rick. He's going into full-time studies. He's going to have to learn to budget a whole lot better than he's done to date, but hopefully not. He's going into a radically changed time in his own life in terms of going into full-time studies. And his position here is going to be quite changed as well. But it's going to be a big change for you too, right? Because the change for you is, and the change between you and Rick is going to be that Rick has always wanted to be. He's so available. He's full-time. You need Rick. You give him a call. You can see him. He goes out for coffee with you. He spends time with you. He visits you. He does all this stuff with you, but he simply won't have that kind of availability as we go into the future with him, right? He'll have a much more circumscribed role at BUC, and that's going to be a tough part of a transition for all of us. And then there's Reverend Jen as well. She's also going through a time of radical transition in her life, and that's going to mean a time of radical transition in our lives as well. So Jen is leaving BUC to spend more time with her family, with her young growing family, and also she's looking at some other career directions in her life. And there's the possibility that Jen and her family will continue to be a part of BUC, and the boys are part of this family, but she's not going to be as available for you in the future either. So you're not going to be able to get on the phone or go see Jen or have her providing pastoral care or support or guidance the way she has, and she's been awesome. But she's not going to be here. And that's going to be, we haven't replaced that position yet as well. And so it's going to be a transitional time for our community. I know the CD committee is thinking, oh, without Jen here, what are we going to do? It's going to be tough. Remember when I was off for 6 months, you had a little bit of that feeling as well, but you had a good team in place who helped us, and that's what I'm going to get to, right? So Jen is leaving as well, and that's going to be a transitional period for us. So transitions and changes are constantly happening, right? They're constantly happening. And so I was reflecting this morning on all of that and thinking, so how did Jesus manage, how did he manage transitions and changes effectively in his life and in his ministry? And the key ingredient that I want to lift up and that we named with the children here right off the bat is that, number one, when Jesus began his ministry, he didn't do it solo, right? His ministry was a communal event and a communal effort. And he made sure that he gathered, even though the disciples weren't particularly well equipped or effective at it, he knew that at some point in time, his capacity to do the ministry was going to come to an end, right? So the key thing that Jesus sets in place right from the beginning of his ministry is he pulls a team together. He pulls a community together. And that's what the church is. The church is the ongoing community, and it's the aftershoot of that team that Jesus originally built. He says, you're not intended to travel the journey of life or the spiritual journey of life alone. You're intended to do it in community. And that's why having healthy, vibrant, alive faith communities is so important. That's what Jesus was trying to establish from the get-go. And he said, God didn't design us to be islands. We are intended to support one another, to care for one another. Where does the Spirit live? Everywhere, all around us, and in each and every one of us. What I always say to all of you is collectively, we are so much more the face of God than any one of us is ever individually. So collectively, we are the face of God to one another, incarnate in space and time. We are meant to be, namaste, we are meant to be the Spirit and the expression of the Spirit and the caring of the Spirit and the life of the Spirit that was manifest in Jesus for one another. It's an interesting thing, and a lot of the Fort McMurray folks, many of them, reporters had conversations with them, and they said going back is going to be really hard. It's a really difficult thing, but they all acknowledged that the losses they experienced were physical losses, and what they've all lifted up is, they've said, though, we are a strong community. Fort McMurray is there's a strong, even though there's a lot of people who parachute in, there is a strong inherent community there. And because it's a northern community and somewhat isolated community, people work together. And that's what they said. While we're all getting back on our feet, we will care for one another, we will support one another in the process. And so that's the key number one thing. In terms of managing any transitions in our life, I often say when somebody is going through a crisis medically, and sometimes people tend to retrench within themselves and they want to rely solely on their partner or their spouse. And I always say to them, your spouse or your partner isn't good at everything that you need. Your partner might be great at emotional support, but they might be a lousy driver, so don't get them driving you, get somebody else to drive you. Or they might be a lousy cook. What you need when you're in a medical kind of crisis is you need to have a team of people around you who will support you and care for you, right? That's what's required. And even at the hospital, the social workers say that. You have your doctors, you have your social workers, you have your spiritual care workers, but you also need to have a community of people who will support you. So community is absolutely critical in terms of facilitating our processing through transitions in our lives, no matter what they are. The second thing that Jesus manifests is that going into the wilderness, though, was an important part of who he was, right? And what we say as people of faith is being grounded in a profound sense of connection with the divine, that transcendent, life-giving dimension is also critically important. Recognizing that our lives aren't totally characterized or defined by the changing circumstances of our lives. The ultimate definition of our lives is namaste. The ultimate definition of my life is that I am an expression of spirit in the world, and I am part of spirit and connected with spirit. I'm part of the divine. And when you feel profoundly rooted in that sense of identity with God, then it's like your touchstone, your true north, that carries you through whatever changes are going on all around you, right? There's this sense of always being able to come home to this touchstone, this sense of Spirit's presence within you. And that's what Jesus had profoundly in his life, and that's what enabled him to face through so many of the difficult challenges and transitions in his life. And finally, the other thing that I want to say about going through transitions is this. It's the recognition, and this is the title of the talk today, that every exit in our life is also an entrance into another place, okay? Sometimes those places are challenging, but very often if we're open to the learning, the possibilities that are present in a transition, even if it's a difficult transition, even if it's a medical crisis, even if it's some kind of a work or relational crisis, if you're open to seeing the possibilities inherent within the crisis and the transition, that openness will lead you to a new door that will lead to, it's an entrance into a new possibility that can be a life-giving possibility. That's what it means to be a resurrection people. That's what resurrection is all about. That out of death, new life, new possibilities continuously emerge. And that's why Jesus as well, even though moving towards his death was a difficult transition, he had that ultimate trust in the divine that even death itself, even the end of this apparent life with which we identify so much, can be a doorway into another possibility, into another future that is full of potential and vibrancy and new life. Because God is a God of life, God is a God of resurrection. And that is absolutely true in no matter, you all know I've gone through a few crises in my life as well, right? We've traveled them together, and all of you have gone through crises in your own lives, right? It's when you shut down and turn inward, become bitter, or become closed as a result of some kind of a transition or a crisis, that you shut down the possibilities for a new doorway to open up in some form or fashion. But when you recognize that an exit can be an entrance into something new, something positive, something life-giving, and you're open to that, then the resurrection power of the universe and of the divine will lead you to those possibilities. Transitions are a pain. I don't like them. That's what Danielle always tells me. She says, you can talk a fine line, but you don't like them. I don't. I don't like transition. I've given Rick heck. I said, why are you doing this? And I said it to Jen too. You're causing me a whole lot of pain and grief here. Now we got to do all this reorganization in the community because of these changes in your life. All right? But it's part of life. None of us likes it. But if we can embrace the possibilities, and there'll be new wonderful possibilities for Rick as well in all of that, right? And for Jen as well. When we can be open to the possibilities and embrace them, feeling rooted in the divine, and also counting on each other for support, then maybe we can work through these transitions much more effectively than we would otherwise. Namaste. Amen.
So let us prepare our hearts and our minds for receiving communion together by listening to the words of Dorothy Day. I'll invite the choir to stand as we sing for you.
We cannot love God unless we love each other. We cannot love God unless we love each other. And to love, we must know each other.
Thank you, choir. That was exquisite as always. When we love one another, we demonstrate the love of God, and God's healing flows through us for one another.
As we prepare the table, some of our children have chosen to come back in and join us for this family meal and celebrations. We're going to let them get settled.
And I'll invite Debbie Morris and Mary Louise Mills to come forward and share with us in this communion meal.
So I believe those are the kids who have chosen to come in.
Okie doke. So friends, we gather together in these last weeks of summer.
Spring.
Yeah, these last weeks of spring before summer begins.
Boom. Summer's over. Let's get back at it. We have to laugh. It's a family meal. If you don't laugh at your family table, then there's something missing, right? We have to laugh at this table, too. It's a family meal.
I'm going to miss you.
Maybe a little quieter as well.
So we gather together in these last weeks before summer begins to celebrate the gifts of life. All the good things that summer brings. Warmth, sunshine, nature blossoming. But also the many other wonderful gifts of life, such as love and community. And on this morning, our special friendship with so many wonderful people around the world. Most of all, we celebrate the Spirit of God who makes all the gifts of life possible and who is made known to the world in Jesus, but also through other great spiritual visionaries throughout time as well.
Jesus gave us a very special way to celebrate God's gifts and celebrate God's presence. He invited us to a meal, not just any meal, but to a banquet, a feast, a celebration that symbolizes God's love and care for us, for humanity. With this meal, Jesus invites us to gather together in community to say thank you. Thank you to God and to one another, to show our love to God and for one another as we share the gift of life together with each other.
So what we always say at BUC is that this meal, it's not just for some people. It's not just for, quote, believers or churchgoers. And, it's not even just for Christians. Yeah. It's for everyone. And that is for any of you, children, our young friends, women or men, who feel grateful for the gifts of life and thankful for the gift of God's life and love revealed in Jesus. You're all welcome to share in this sacred meal.